Hello, and welcome to Connect and Collaborate, a podcast of the Colorado Business Roundtable brought to you by ACEC Colorado. I'm your on air producer, Keenan Brew, and I'm incredibly excited because today we're going to be diving a little bit into cybersecurity with our guest expert here, Christopher Walcutt. Please welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. I'm excited to get to know you and this topic a little bit more. Let's first start off with a little introduction of yourself to the audience. Introduce us. Who are you? What's your background?
All right. Currently, I'm the Vice President of Strategy for a boutique cybersecurity firm based in the Denver Tech Center called Direct Defense. The firm's been around since 2011. I've been in the industry about 20 years. So I started on a IT help desk for a Fortune 200 energy company. And when I left there, I was Director of IT and OT risk and compliance over 30-some power plants.
Wow.
I went from there to SunGard and helped run their threat and vulnerability management practice for 3 years. And then on to Black & Veatch, which is a large engineering firm about 100 years old, and was there almost 7 years in the security risk and compliance practice, and then was also the deputy CISO internally for part of that. I've been with Direct Defense about 2.5 years, and my focus primarily is on cybersecurity and risk for critical infrastructure. I've been working with ACEC in various roles, both locally and nationally for about 5 years, and then also with the Engineering Change Lab, ECL USA, in similar role.
Well, excellent. Thanks for joining us today here on the show, Connect and Collaborate, as well as for joining the ACEC Summit on Infrastructure and Innovation. So that's an incredible background. So you were in charge of cybersecurity for many, many different power plants, which I would certainly qualify as important key infrastructure, and you would know more than I do. How would you describe some of the most important challenges we as a country are facing, or these industries, these facilities are facing as cybersecurity risks out there?
Well, cybersecurity is an ever-changing space. And our critical infrastructure, a lot of it was built 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. So part of the challenge is around maintaining the viability and the reliability and resilience of the infrastructure, because in a lot of cases, it's not possible just to pick up and upgrade the systems. That does happen from time to time, but when everybody talks about IoT and connected things and Internet of Things, they don't always think about something like a power plant. The devices inside are connected, but it's a business decision for the power plant owner to make. How much information do I need to get out of the plant, juxtaposed against the need to protect it? So 20 years ago, there was no federal regulation around that, but in 2006, there was a series of regulations put in place called NERC-CIP. It's critical infrastructure protection. The interesting thing is it only applied to the energy sector. So that was an effort to go through and secure the bulk power electric infrastructure for this country and North America. So something in Canada or Mexico that interacts with the bulk power system in the US also applies. So I've in the past have had functional roles with NERC as a co-chair of part of their supply chain working group. And that's been an interesting case study, because as a lot of organizations look to upgrade their infrastructure, they're having to make decisions now that are based on interacting with devices that are much more advanced than they used to be. Now they can theoretically talk to the internet, not that you would ever want a power plant to do that, but they have that capability. So there's a lot of different choices that need to be made than there were when they were built.
Absolutely. A lot of that was built a long time ago, like you were describing, and some things may benefit from being online if they can have smarter Internet of Things, decision-making, load sharing, information, data analytics, and then even beyond what's directly connected, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but now with more sophisticated threats out there, certain aspects of things that the infrastructure that may not even be directly connected to the internet may still have certain vulnerabilities you want to protect against. I mean, so-called air gap attacks, some person plugs in a USB or something they shouldn't, and some programmable logic controller starts giving some weird information. What could you describe a little bit about some of the ways both engineers like yourself with a computer science background can work with engineers working with the physical infrastructure in making this a safer, more reliable system?
So I've had the pleasure and the luxury of working with engineers for the majority of my career. Probably 15 or more of my 20 years have been spent directly interacting with engineers. And one of the things that we discuss a lot is the role of the engineer in a position of public trust. And that terminology is typically used in the government to represent somebody with a low-level security clearance. But from my perspective, engineers, whether it's civil, mechanical, electrical, nuclear, they touch a lot of those spaces. They have access to the technical drawings. They interact with the technology. And in a lot of cases, the engineering firms themselves are either the engineering design or the integrators for those systems. So that level of responsibility means that they need to have a little bit of understanding basics of cybersecurity and cyber hygiene, because a lot of times they're in the room when important decisions are made. A perfect example is there was a client of mine that ran the power grid for a portion of a state. And they had made a design decision to procure a specific piece of equipment to allow them to control part of the power grid remotely over a network that they owned. And that particular device, they had deployed a couple thousand of them. And during some testing, we went out and I managed to find a vulnerability in it that allowed me to get back into the control center that would have allowed access to take control of that part of the power grid. And so, the manager who was with me at the time, I could see, her face start to change color a little bit as I'm discovering these things. And I said, "Hey, do you want me to leave this on or just turn it off for you?" She's like, no, don't touch it. But the importance of it is, when we went back and had a discussion, we stopped the assessment and we went back and wrote something up and we approached the vendor and said, "Hey, this is your device. I found this problem." And their response was, "Well, we don't do a lot of work in critical infrastructure and we're not a US-based company, so we're not subject to the regulations. We're not really going to do anything about it right now." Ooh. And so at the end of the day, that particular company had to buy several thousand new devices and then one by one roll a truck and a person to go exchange them. And so that was a clear and concise example for me of a design consideration where an engineer might have been able, as the integrator or as the engineering designer, to say, we need to make sure that we procure some of these devices you want to deploy and do some testing on them, both for resilience and security and functionality before they go into the field. And I think most engineers by discipline do have that testing phase built in, but the cyber side is not always a consideration. And so as I look at the future of engineering and engineering education, I've told a lot of organizations I speak with, there should be a consideration that a basic level of cybersecurity and cyber hygiene should really be built into the engineering disciplines in school, from my perspective.
That's a great example and a great recommendation. They do have the design thinking about the physical engineering, but the earlier and the more they understand about some of the cybersecurity practices, engineering systems, the better off they're going to be. It's a good thing that company hired you to be able to do that pen test and figure out where the vulnerabilities were. But if they had talked to you or had a similar education ahead of time, they could have saved themselves a lot of trouble, money, and some flushed faces in those conversations, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And it's one of those considerations where, my company works alongside engineering firms in some cases if they don't have a cyber practice. When I was at Black and Beach, we had one, obviously, but working alongside them to provide an expertise that they may or may not have. But it's also part of educating them to be able to say, what, we need to consider this. Maybe let's get the right person in the room. And it might be that their end client, who's going to be the system owner, has the right expertise. You just need to make sure they're there. So the system owner really is the one who maintains control of their ecosystem. And they have to decide what they want to allow in that ecosystem, whether it's a good bacteria or a bad virus. So, these are all part of larger discussions that I like to have, particularly with engineers, because they've got the right mindset to understand it. But they are also that steward of information, that steward of thought process.
I think it's incredibly forward thinking that ACEC Colorado was able to invite you and thought ahead to invite you to their Infrastructure and Innovation Summit to help with this education. Some of the people in the audience at the event may not have had a lot of thought around this, and definitely some of the members in our audience, I've just considered it now in this conversation far more than I ever have before. What are some additional things you're seeing as you're talking to clients or as you hear people that could be clients? Are people aware of these threats? Are they still trying to learn? I'm grateful to see that the national government has started setting up some of these regulations and things, but it's interesting with some companies outside of the US, they may not care as much. And I'm wondering about the end customers. Do a lot of the power generation plants and companies, are they actively thinking about this?
So when you look across critical infrastructure, at least in North America, the energy sector, their hand has sort of been forced since 2006.
Okay.
the president signed the America's Water Infrastructure Act in 2018. We call it AWIA, American Water Works Association. I also am a subject matter expert for them in this. They signed something that is in process right now, and that is an all threats risk assessment against the drinking water infrastructure across the U.S. There's about 10,000 drinking water utilities, more or less, that have about 3 years to complete it. But if you look at the time gap, energy infrastructure is 2006. Now, the nuclear energy side is a little bit different. They've had restrictions in place far longer.
Yeah.
But the bulk power energy non-nuclear is 2006. AWIA was signed in 2018. But gas pipeline, refineries, mining, there's all these other pieces of critical infrastructure. And then there are other pieces. So I talk a lot with clients about their business critical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Let's say you are a food product manufacturer and your production line is all automated. If it goes down, you may lose product. If your refrigeration system, which is automated, goes down, could cost you millions of dollars and put you out of business. There's national critical infrastructure, and then there is business critical infrastructure, and you need to consider applying the same controls across the board. Frankly, that's just one of the pieces of education that I try to get everybody to understand is, everyone is a steward of something in their business model. It's just, what that may be is going to change from here to there.
Absolutely. So it makes sense the nuclear industry's been pretty forward thinking and the importance and the risks involved in energy since 2006. And were you saying that the water industry, that water infrastructure is only recently in 2018 started to get some of the same treatment? Interesting. Wow, that's
and then
fascinating.
There's several others that lag behind that even.
Yeah.
At this point.
Wow. And even as some of these other industries are looking at the overall trend and importance of applying this type of security-minded thinking, the field itself, I'm sure, is continuing to evolve. Maybe there were a couple viruses in the 90s, and it's gotten a lot crazier with all the potential vectors of attacks as more people have had access to understand how computers can work or how you can make them work against the way they're supposed to. What are some of the new areas of either threats or opportunities to increase protection as you see them right now?
Well, I think one thing that's important to remember is that roughly 80% of all cyber breaches are still human-based.
Human-based.
So in the vast majority of cases, it is still a human making a mistake, doing something they should not have done. If we take the Ukrainian power grid hack that everyone assumes was a Russian-affiliated gang, it's never obviously been proven, but based on that assumption, that attack was very targeted. It happened just a couple days before Christmas. It was later in the day towards a shift change, targeting people that were preoccupied. But what's more interesting is they had been on that network for roughly, let's call it 6 months prior. And that occurred through targeted spear phishing emails. So somebody was sent an email. They were opening email on a computer that was connected to the power grid, which that was mistake number one. Mistake number two was clicking on a link that they shouldn't have that was compromised. And that provided access. And that's a common way for attackers to get in. So when we talk about how to make things more secure, number one, first and foremost, is training and education. People need to have a little bit of diligence about their mechanisms of how they interact with computers. If it's tied to a critical system, don't open your email on it, just period. That way you can't make that mistake. Don't go to the internet on it if you don't have to. Those systems should be air-gapped. That doesn't mean that, and this has also never been admitted, but it doesn't mean somebody like the US government isn't going to write a virus, maybe not, like Stuxnet, which got carried past an air-gapped in Iran into, the centrifuges. But that was very specific and targeted. It just so happened that the manufacturer of that control system, Siemens, had similar infrastructure deployed across the US at the time. So they didn't quite maybe think that one through. I was actually in the process of assessing a power grid substation the day that was released in the news, and it just so turned out that substation had similar software running it. So, potentially problematic.
Well, especially once that particular situation became public and other people might have seen the idea or the actual code to be able to reuse parts of it too as well. So
the software that was used against Ukraine was actually specifically designed to be modular and to be reusable. So that one was one where someone could take and modify and plug in a new portion specifically to target a different type of infrastructure. It was set up almost containerized. So it's interesting to see that happen. I'm not surprised that it did. And then there was one called the Mirai botnet, which happened also a couple of years ago. And that was all about IoT devices. So there were hundreds of thousands of connected surveillance cameras, and the Ring doorbell didn't exist at the time, but that would have been a good example. The Ring doorbells or the DVRs, and they basically used them and turned them into a weapon that they turned against some major companies that you would know. So like parts of Google and Facebook were down for part of a day based on them being able to weaponize all these IoT connected and unmanaged devices. You can log in, but you can't change the password, and they don't offer security patches, and they tell you not to update it. You can't go in and change some of the security features. A lot's changed since then, but that's still the wild, wild west. There is no overarching regulation around, okay, if you're gonna, in fact, Ring just got dinged over a threat that they had, and they had to go back and enable some more enhanced security vulnerability prevention features because one was found that allowed for a compromise and people to get onto your home network. So the human element is one piece, particularly with email security, multi-factor authentication. So, and this one is a pain point because it's kind of a pain in the rear for people to do, but it's definitely worth the prevention that it offers. So anytime you go to log into your email, and whether it's a corporate email, through Office 365 or Microsoft, or it's your Gmail or your Yahoo or whatever your account may be, they all now offer multi-factor or two-factor authentication. Whether you choose to use something like the Microsoft Authenticator app, Google's in a little bit of hot water right now over vulnerabilities in their Authenticator app.
Really?
But yes, there was a compromise found in there. So whether or not you have a text come to your phone and enter that code, or use one of the Authenticator apps or another mechanism, those types of things go a very long way towards preventing about 70 to 80% of the available compromises. They're not going to get you totally out of the woods, but they really do go a long way towards preventing the easy attacks.
So it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, and please feel free to correct me, it's both important to educate us humans in how to have best practices, not open emails, click on things we really shouldn't. And it's also part of the initial design. If this computer doesn't need internet, maybe we should just not have it hooked up at all. And maybe we should enforce two-factor authentication type standards across the organization. You were describing that humans are often the biggest weak link, but I'm curious also about the Wild West with some of this IoT type technology, which has a lot of opportunity to get better analytics and different things, but it's still kind of in development, and there's probably 0 days and other vulnerabilities no one's ever thought of out there in the future. What can you describe as, what does the Wild West look like right now going into 2020?
So if you Google, or if you go on Amazon and let's say and search for connected devices, you'll find everything from thermostats to surveillance cameras to lights to actually powered outlets. So you plug an outlet into an outlet and then it connects to your Wi-Fi or your Bluetooth. You will find connected garage door openers. You'll find connected door locks. You'll find connected alarm systems, fire alarms, all of this infrastructure. Some of them are very well developed and built into an ecosystem, like Google's got their Home Hub, Amazon has their Alexa infrastructure. Others are maybe a little bit cheaper, and somebody who doesn't have a lot of money might be tempted to go down that path. But what they need to consider is whether or not that company just is good at making the thing that they want, or is also good about preparing the software side of it to be secure and reliable and realistic in the expectations that somebody can't use it to then hack into other things in your home. So those considerations are frankly pretty important. We have clients that come to us that make devices, and a lot of them are commercial industrial. They're not your home device type stuff. But there's definitely a consideration that those things need to be tested by security professionals and know what they're doing and identify gaps. And there are groups of people in my industry who spend their time just hunting for threats and bugs and vulnerabilities, and then they, in a judicious manner, report them to the manufacturers of the devices, give them some time to come up with a solution, and then they disclose it to the public. So that's considered sort of the best practice, the ethical practice in my industry. But there are plenty of people who aren't going to go down that path. And maybe they're in it for the money, like whoever it was that took down Ukraine's power grid. Or so, for instance, when I speak, sometimes I'll ask the poll of the audience, can anybody, and nobody ever can anybody tell me the name of the air conditioning vendor, the HVAC vendor that got Target breached? Nobody ever knows. Nobody cares. Target got breached. But Target's cyber hygiene should have included vetting their third parties who have uncontrolled access to their network. Or maybe saying, you don't need uncontrolled access to the network. When you need access, call us and we'll turn your access on, and then when we're finished, we'll turn it back off. Instead, they got in through the HVAC vendor, much smaller company, didn't have the same cyber posture, and they hung out on that network for 6 months and slowly made their way into the point of sale system and got all those credit cards.
Wow.
So,
and that's a great example. I was about to ask, so in addition to the biggest obvious examples I can imagine of, a hacker turning off a power grid and that causing obvious chaos, you just mentioned like the example with Target. There's also the risk of exfiltration of data, whether it's private customer sensitive data like credit card numbers, or maybe trade secrets or designs that could either be copied and just economic damage by a competitor now having your technology, or maybe that information could open up a way for them to design other types of attacks based on that privy information they shouldn't have had in the future at all, really. How can you describe a little bit of how do we plan ahead for things if sometimes we've never seen certain attacks or vectors? What's the best way to go about doing that?
So the concept of defense in depth is a little bit cliche at this point in my industry, but there are pieces of it that still apply. And it's about having a multi-layered capability to protect, and then having the visibility to see what's going on. So you educate the users, you protect the endpoint, which is their individual computers. You need some visibility on the connected infrastructure, the network, to be able to understand what's going on. And you need to have a baseline for what is normal traffic and communication on that network. Without that, you don't necessarily have the ability to figure out what's an anomaly. So with a baseline, anomalous detection allows you to look at the other behaviors around associated and figure out what might be a problem. There's been a big push for a user behavior analytics over the past few years, which is to say, if you are Joe and you normally come to work and log in between 8 and 9 a.m. and you're normally out between 4 or 5 p.m., maybe somebody should be aware if you suddenly randomly log in on 3 a.m. on a Saturday. Not that you did anything wrong, you might have been sick and you have work to catch up on, but at least somebody should be aware that potentially there's something to look at that's out of the norm. And that's all about the baselining. Then you also take a look at holistically how the flow of information functions. And there's business decisions to be made, because you can't always go to the most secure. Air gap doesn't work for every company in every situation. But if you need to get data out for business analytics purposes, maybe you bring it to one point that's more secure and then transfer it from there to another point, instead of allowing all the endpoints to communicate the data out of a secure network where you have the opportunity to hack back against all these insecure, and in a lot of cases, devices that can't be secured. On top of that, when we look at, and this is particular for engineers and engineering firms, they a lot of times have access to critical infrastructure data. So they'll have drawings, technical drawings, plans. If you were a terrorist that was interested in maybe knocking down a building or blowing up a bridge, they might become a target for you to be able to get that information. If you are a cyber threat actor of some kind that's just trying to steal information to make money, maybe industrial espionage, you take it from one company and then offer it for sale on the black market to another company. Software is the same thing. If you can hijack, engineering firms in some cases develop their own software applications that do digital data transformation. So maybe you're working with a client that is a water utility, and you want to be able to take their data and give them some fancy dashboards so they can determine whether or not they're making right flow decisions or chemical decisions or all kinds of bits and pieces of this. If you could compromise that software, maybe you could make changes to it that would potentially make people sick. There's a lot of different scenarios where having access to that information is potentially problematic. And really that focus on the cyber hygiene and proper secure design is a big part of it. But like I said, it's like defense in depth is really the layers of the onion, how it all wraps back together, and having multiple layers of protection and visibility and awareness.
Excellent. There's so much to this topic, and I know there's so much more for me to learn. A lot of what we've been talking about and fits with ACEC has been around this infrastructure. For those of our audience members who aren't in the engineering and construction world, what are some simple tips or tricks you could just recommend for any average internet user to up their security game just a little bit?
Got a good one for you. So Amazon has a group of employees whose sole job it is to listen to interactions with Alexa. And the reason behind that, and it's a legitimate business reason, is that they need to be able to determine and help make the algorithms more effective so that when you're actually talking to Alexa, Alexa understands that you want to talk to the platform and be able to interact correctly. Given that, I might advise that if you have one in your bedroom, you unplug it from time to time.
It's a great example, a great piece of advice. I know in my household personally, we only have ours off in the studio workshop, so it's not allowed in the home, though it is incredibly useful. So it's that catch-22 of how do you make the most of technology and use it, but not let it have some negative side effects if something outside of the original design were to happen, like a hack. Want to give our audience... Oh, go ahead.
Another one I'll get into that doesn't necessarily relate to engineering is autonomous vehicles. So I spoke last Wednesday in Arizona on a panel that was talking about autonomous vehicles, and Chandler, Arizona is one of the cities that has a large deployment. So Waymo has made a push there. It's one of their big test sites. And the mayor was on the panel with me, and he was discussing how he had gotten in a Waymo to go to church. And as it was driving along, there was a marathon being run. And so they had one lane of the road blocked off with cones, and they had runners. Well, the vehicle was really confused because all of its sensors were not used to people being in a roadway. And so it took him on this grand detour to get to church, just as a design consideration. The topic that I brought up is there are cameras in a lot of those autonomous vehicles, whether it's Waymo or Uber or whoever it is. And there is now very advanced eye tracking software available. So let's say, for instance, as these start to become more commercialized, that the Bluetooth is turned on in your phone, as it is for a lot of people, and you're in the vehicle, and as it's passing by some storefronts, you happen to pay particular attention to one. The eye tracking software would have the ability to see the direction you looked, interact with the other sensors in the vehicle, the GPS and the cameras, know where you were, and then maybe push some advertising content to your phone via Bluetooth. It's called a Bluetooth beacon. So that the next time you pull up a search browser, maybe you get content advertising that particular store.
Wow.
So there's privacy considerations for some of this integrated infrastructure that people don't consider.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have to start considering this more in the future as it does roll out, but it's based on what you were describing with the engineering infrastructure. It's important to do some considerations ahead of time before jumping in and then figuring out the negative potentials after the fact. I know we're running out of time here, Chris, but I want to give our listeners, everyone, but especially those in the design, construction, engineering space, an opportunity to follow you and follow Direct Defense's work. How can people find you individually as well as your company? How can they get a hold of you?
So directdefense.com is our website. I am also on LinkedIn. In fact, the American Waterworks Association tagged me yesterday for a SME white paper on cybersecurity for that America's Water Infrastructure Act I mentioned. I go by the Cyber Pirate on Twitter. So as we plunder through the internet looking for pirate treasure, all kinds of fun stuff happens. But in addition, I'll put in one other plug that I like to throw in. So among other things, I'm a mentor in a program called Cyber Patriot. It's a national middle school and high school cyber defense competition. There's about 5,000 teams in the country. It's run by the Air Force Association and sponsored by Northrop Grumman and Microsoft and Cisco. And it is our best capability of closing the cyber workforce gap, and it's a lot of fun for the kids. So roughly 30,000 kids in the program. My team won the national championship in the All-Service Division in 2016. And we continue to push to try to educate kids in this area and mentor and foster, growth and team creative thinking and the kinds of skills that they need to be successful in the future, whether they stick with cybersecurity or venture into something else.
That's amazing. Even if they venture somewhere else, that's going to be useful information to have a more educated population. Congratulations on winning the competition with that. And thank you so much for your service to the country and the world by promoting these types of thoughts and systems and better engineering. Chris, the cyber pirate Walcutt, I really appreciate your time here today. Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to give our listeners a chance to follow you. We'll have links and descriptions here below. You've been listening to Connect and Collaborate, a podcast of the Colorado Business Roundtable, brought to you by ACEC Colorado. Thanks again, Chris. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
You got it. And thank you to our listeners. See you again next time.